some of you know, Rivers is going to be celebrating its 100th anniversary in a little over a year. I've been doing some research over the past few years on the history of the school, and there are a lot of really fascinating stories related to that history. Today I want to talk to you about one part of that story, which is the story of this campus. In the historical record, this campus is referred to, or this property is referred to in a variety of different ways. Sometimes it's simply known as Nonesuch, sometimes it's referred to as Nonesuch Field, sometimes it's referred to as a farm called Nonesuch. However it's referred to, it was owned at the time of the American Revolution by Elisha Jones. Jones was born in 1710. He lived most of his life in Weston. This is the house he built for his family in 1754. At the time that this house went up, it was considered the most elegant mansion in Weston. Jones built this house on Highland Street, which is just outside the center of town. The owner of the house in 1883 moved it to Old Post Road, which is the main road that runs through the town of Weston, and that same owner moved it 5 years later in 1888 to Church Street, where it is today. Any of you who have done community service work at the Roxbury-Weston preschool or have been to the First Parish Church in downtown Weston, that big stone church, you've probably seen the house because it sits on a little hill just behind the church. Elisha Jones is a really fascinating Revolutionary War figure from this area. He's someone who had incredible energy. He was active in all sorts of ways in the community, and he was incredibly successful at all the things he did. He served the town of Weston as a selectman, a representative to the general court or legislature. He was the town treasurer, and he was the town clerk. And notice that in 1754 he held all of those positions at the same time. He was also a sheriff and justice of the peace in Middlesex County. His business interests were equally varied and diverse. He owned the general store in Weston, which sold a large number of products, as you can see. He sold coffins and other materials necessary to provide a proper funeral. He had a tremendous reputation for his ability to pull teeth. He bought and sold a large variety of types of wood and transported it up and down the Charles River to the various mills that were located on the banks of the river. He was a banker. He had really close ties to the merchants of downtown Boston. He provided all sorts of banking services to the people of Weston. Most importantly for us, though, he was a real estate developer. He owned 274 acres of land in the town of Weston, including 85 out around Nonesuch Pond. He also owned about 9,000 acres of land in 4 other towns: Princeton, Adams, Pittsfield, and Peru. To put that into perspective, Weston today is slightly more than 11,000 acres of land. He owns about 9,400 acres of land, so he owns almost as much land at the time of the Revolution as there is in the town of Weston today. Jones was also a family man. He had 12 children that lived till adulthood, 11 boys and 1 girl. And for those of you who have siblings, notice that his oldest son was born in 1734, and his youngest son was born 26 years later. So there's a 26-year gap between his oldest and his youngest sons. Now, those of you who have grown up in this area are well aware of the importance of the Metro West in the American Revolution, particularly the early parts of it. While a large majority of people from this region supported the revolutionary cause, there were quite a number of people who did not. They were supporters of the king and the parliament, and these people are known as loyalists. And Jones and most of his sons were most definitely loyalists. Jones got into a lot of trouble with his neighbors because of his outspoken support for the king and the parliament during the revolution. And so there were reports like this in the Boston newspapers in the days leading up to the war. In this particular case, his house was surrounded by 300 men. They made him walk a gauntlet, and then he had to sign a statement saying he wouldn't try to recruit people for militias that were fighting on behalf of the king. Early the following year, the town of Sudbury held a meeting in which they condemned the efforts of local loyalists to recruit militias on behalf of the king, and they specifically singled out Jones for his role in this activity. Bottom line is, as 1774 progressed, it became harder and harder for Jones to feel safe in the town of Weston, so he left Weston and moved to Boston. There was a large Loyalist community there, and they also felt very secure in the presence of British troops that were stationed there. During the summer of 1775, Jones did finally form that militia that he wanted to form. You can see that he's the second in command, and three of his sons joined another company that was formed on the same day. So they were actively involved in fighting on behalf of the king. Jones died in February of 1776. He was 66 years old. He died in Boston. Within about a month of that event, the British troops withdrew from Boston. Boston celebrates this each year as Evacuation Day. It's a holiday that is only celebrated in Boston. But at that point, most of the Loyalists who were in Boston decided that they needed to go. And many of them went to Canada, some went to England, but there were a number of members of Jones's family that went to Canada at that point. Over the next few years, the Massachusetts legislature took up the issue of Loyalists. In 1778, they passed a Banishment Act, which prohibited any Loyalist who had left Massachusetts from returning to the state. There were 308 people specifically listed in that Banishment Act, and 3 of them were children of Elisha Jones. The following year, 1779, the Mass legislature passed 2 confiscation acts. They gave permission to the cities and towns of Massachusetts to take any property that had been abandoned by Loyalists. And as you can imagine, the Jones family and Massachusetts were on kind of a collision course because of both of these acts. Now, when the war ended, the Treaty of Paris called upon the states to make restitution or provide compensation for people who had lost property during the course of the war. And in Article 6, it also called on the states to stop confiscating property and to also stop prosecuting Loyalists. As you can see from the list of Jones's properties in the Metro West, 4 of his properties had already been sold at the time that the peace treaty was signed. But notice that 3 of his properties were still awaiting auction at the time of the treaty. And notice that the property that we're on right now, the Rivers property, was not sold until March 1785, which is a year and a half after the treaty was signed. So that seems like a pretty gross violation of the spirit of that treaty, if nothing else. Jones's children worked really hard after the war to recover the property that the family had lost. They were unsuccessful in their efforts for the most part. They, like many Loyalists, turned their attention to the various commissions that the king and the Parliament set up to help Loyalists. They listened to Loyalist stories. They took lists of property that Loyalists believed that they had taken. And the king and the Parliament provided some pretty big payouts to the various Loyalists for the support they had shown during the course of the war. The Jones family submitted a huge number of claims, but they did receive some money, but it came nowhere near what they had hoped to get from the government. Now, despite those setbacks, all of Jones's children were pretty successful, both in their lives and in their careers after the war. 4 of his sons actually stayed in New England and lived out their lives here. One was one of the original trustees of Williams College. One became a chief judge in New Hampshire. 5 of his children ended up in Canada. They had gone there and they remained there. Another settled in London, and his youngest son, Charles, was actually killed in the Battle of Yorktown, fighting for the British side. A couple of quick notes here about the family before we get back to the property. As I noted earlier, Jones had one daughter. Her name was Mary. She married the Reverend Asa Dunbar, who was a minister in Salem, and he actually commuted from Weston to Salem, but that's a story for another day. They had a daughter named Cynthia. Cynthia married John Thoreau, Jr. of Concord, and they are the parents of Henry David Thoreau, one of America's greatest authors. So Elisha Jones is actually the great-grandfather of Henry David Thoreau. Arguably, Jones's most famous son was Ephraim. He settled in Upper Canada and had a very distinguished career as a judge and legislator there. He had a number of sons who were very involved in Canadian politics as well. And if you pick up a Canadian history book, you'll see the Jones family name everywhere. They've got pretty extensive biographies in the Canadian Dictionary of Biography as well. An interesting note on Ephraim's family, and again, I realize you can't read this, but this is Ephraim here in that box in the left corner, and then this bottom line here is a currently living descendant of Ephraim. And I'd like to draw your attention to her. Her name is Camilla Rosemary Shand. She was born in London in 1947. She's better known probably to most of you as Camilla Parker Bowles. She is the wife of Prince Charles, who is the heir to the British throne. So that makes Elisha Jones her great-great-great-great-great-grandfather. That's 6 greats. So finishing up here, as I noted earlier, this property was auctioned off in 1785. The land was actually bought by the cousin of Elisha Jones, his cousin Isaac, who owned and operated the Golden Ball Tavern in downtown Weston. If you've ever been in downtown Weston, you've probably driven by it. Isaac Jones and his family owned this property a little past the turn of the 19th century, and they sold it to Henry Loker at that point. If any of you drive in on Winter Street from the Natick side, you drive by a little red house just beyond the girls' soccer field. That was Henry Loker's house. He used this as a farm. There's a little white plaque on the side of the house that says Henry Loker home. But this property stayed in the Loker family for many years into the 20th century from that point. Bits and pieces of it were broken off for various members of the family to build their houses on. But some friends of Rivers got together in the early 1950s. They bought the big chunk of property, which was the Loker farm, and then they bought some of the smaller pieces as well, and consolidated those so that by 1958 they owned all of the property that is currently this campus. The groundbreaking ceremony took place in 1959, and as many of you know, the school opened the following year. And the rest, as they say, is history.